Hey, it's Tyler, host of the Tyler Knows Everything podcast, where the nose is crossed out because I always want to learn more. My guest today is the Honorable Mitch Templeton, presiding over the 172nd District Court in Jefferson County, Texas. In this episode, we talk about the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Please welcome Mitch Templeton.
Tyler
knows
everything.
The great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule. I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes in governing themselves than any smaller class or body of men, no matter what their training, will make in trying to govern them. I believe again that the American people are, as a whole, capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes.
All right, everybody, we're here with Mitch Templeton, the Quintessential Texan that I like to call him. I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time because I've been friends with you for several years now and helped out a little bit with your campaign. And I had this idea of bringing you on to showcase the history of Teddy Roosevelt. A lot of people are really into that nowadays with Netflix. There's lots of documentaries that millennials are actually getting into. And so, thanks for coming on. First, we'll kind of go into a little bit of your origin story and your upbringing and how you got to where you are now. And then we'll kind of switch gears and talk about Theodore Roosevelt.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, like you said, my name is Mitch Templeton. I'm the currently state district judge. I'm the judge of a trial court, the 172nd District Court here in Beaumont, Texas. I was born in Austin, Texas. I'm proud that you refer to me as the quintessential Texan. I appreciate that. I was born in the state capital in 1964. My mother was a co-ed at the University of Texas studying nursing, and my father grew up in Austin, went to McCallum High School in Austin, Texas, and was at St. Edward's when they met, and that's how I came to be. I was born in 1964, April 6, 1964, and during that time period, local communities in Texas began establishing hospital districts. And that allowed communities to basically tax themselves and use that pool of tax money to build hospitals. As that was occurring, my parents moved east from Austin. They first went to Waco, then to Navasota, and then ended up in Jasper to open Jasper Memorial Hospital. I grew up there, graduated from Jasper High School in 1982, and married my high school sweetheart, Janelle. We both graduated from the University of Texas ourselves in 1986 and went to Houston. I went to work for a company called NCR and Financial Systems. She passed the CPA exam and went to work for a Big 8 accounting firm. And when we got out of law school, I decided to go to law school. NCR was going to send me to Dayton, Ohio. I was a good salesperson. I was 110% of quota my first year at NCR and 100% of quota my second year. And the next step would be management training in Dayton, Ohio. And as much as I enjoyed going to Dayton for training, I did not want to live there, did not want to leave Texas.
Right.
And so went to law school at the University of Houston, and in 1991 completed my Juris Doctorate, and we moved to Beaumont to be closer to our family back over in East Texas.
Okay.
And I've been in Beaumont practicing law ever since. And, of course, ran for judge last year, which you're aware of since you were on my committee. And I appreciate that.
Thank you.
We won, and I've been serving in the capacity as the district judge since January.
Yeah, and you winning that campaign was a little bit of a milestone, right? It was the first Republican judge elected in Jefferson County in how many years?
The first district judge ever elected as a Republican in Jefferson County. Since Reconstruction, at least. So for 150 years, there's never been a Republican state district judge.
Yeah, so over a century.
We've had county judges. We've had 3 county-wide offices that I know of, but never a district judge. And the district judge is the highest level of trial court. It hears the unlimited damage in civil cases, and it deals with felonies in criminal cases.
Yeah, and I think you definitely had a lot of crossover votes looking at some of the metrics.
I couldn't have won without crossover votes. And so it's been a great year. I can't believe it's already been a year, but it's really been exactly what I expected. And
There are a lot of creative things that you were able to do to speed up the efficiency of the judicial process, or in your court, for example.
well, what I've been able to do is hear civil and criminal cases.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a judge. I could not have foreseen this, but it's just exactly why I was the correct candidate. We had the Drug Impact Court judge, Judge Gist, got very ill at the beginning of the year and then passed away. And when he got ill, I began picking up his docket, as did one of the other district judges, Judge Walston. And by the way, Judge West and Judge Stevens, who are the criminal court, district court designees, their courts are the criminal courts in Jefferson County.
Mm-hmm.
They refer cases to this court. And so it was their leadership that allowed me and Judge Walston to do this. So instead of paying visiting judges to come in, and instead of people, floundering in jail, waiting on their trial date, we were able to move the cases. And so no one was delayed. In terms of efficiencies, the whole idea is not to have backlogs, especially when you have people in jail. It's not fair to them, and it costs the county about $110 a day to house someone in jail.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So we need to move their cases. Either they need to be exonerated with a trial, they need to be found guilty and go on to TDC, or if it's a time served situation and they've already been in county jail for an appropriate amount of time to mete out punishment, then they need to be released.
Sure.
And so there's your efficiency. I mean, but it's, you really got 2 for 1 with me, because I have been a civil and criminal law practitioner. And because the court is a court of general jurisdiction, it can hear both kinds of cases. It just hasn't been doing that before my election.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to go back on about your long marriage that you've had, because that's unfortunately that's a rare case these days that you see. You and your wife actually met each other. You were how old?
15. Well, we met in the 5th grade, but we started dating in the 9th grade.
Yeah.
It's funny because I can still remember how it all happened. I mean, we were in the same church youth group growing up. Her father was a pastor, moved to Jasper in 1975. We would have both been in the 5th grade. And I always liked her and was always a friend of hers, but I didn't really become romantically interested in her, if you will, until the 9th grade. In algebra.
That's about when that happens, I guess.
Yeah. No. Actually, it was 10th grade.
Yeah.
First, it was actually 10th grade, because it would have been November 16th, 1979 is when we went on our first date. That would be the first half of the 10th grade. And the way it really kind of came about is, her name was Smith, mine was Templeton, and we were, the teacher in Algebra 2 sat us alphabetically.
S&T.
Yeah, and so she sat right next to me.
Yeah.
And she was, she's a CPA now. She was much better in math than I was, and so.
And so how many years of total marriage?
33.
33, wow.
Yeah, but we went on our first date 40 years ago last week. But
Goodness.
We've only been married 33 years, so.
Oh, yeah. So over 3 decades. Well, there's many factors that go into a successful marriage, but what are a few that you could pass along to the youngsters listening?
Well, first of all, there's a mantra that we have attempted to live, and we have lived by it, actually. Marriage is an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person. And she adds another blurb on it. I can't quote what she added to it, but we actually learned that in a premarital, marriage preparation class that we took together when we were at UT. And you really have to become selfless. You have to die to yourself. And that means sometimes saying, I'm sorry, when you don't really feel like saying I'm sorry. It really means saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me, and I'm going to try real hard not to do that again.
Right.
Even when you don't feel like you're at fault. You really have to become selfless, and you both will feel that way. And then, of course, it's real important to honor your marriage vows. When you get into a situation of infidelity, that doesn't require divorce, but that's a whole different can of worms, and that opens up a a degree of hurt and a degree of mistrust and pain that, you know, even Christ said was an excuse to get out of a marriage. And so, you know, it's really just dying to yourself and working really, really hard.
Yeah.
It's grinding.
Sure.
It's a grind. People will like to talk about CrossFit and how much of a grind it is. And it is. It's a great thing. And I think people of this generation can relate to how much of a grind CrossFit is. Well, that kind of grind works in a lot of settings. It works at work.
Yeah.
It works in a marriage.
Sure.
And relationships take work.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And how many children do you guys?
2.
So 2.
One of them here with us today in the studio. We're blessed with 2 sons, Caleb and Joshua.
And so in raising your sons, I know you and I talk sometimes about what's going on in the world now where masculinity is kind of viewed as being toxic in some senses. And when you're raising a son, and, you know, especially in Texas too, that can be a big deal. You know, you want to teach your son to shake people's hands and look them in the eye and, you know, and stand up when they're talking. What are your thoughts on I guess raising them and then now them being men in 2019?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I do think that the American male is under attack and has been emasculated, but not even there are forces that overtly are attempting to do that, but it's our society emasculates men, in my opinion. It's been my experience that, you know, practicing law can emasculate you. You become a slave to work, and it's very sedentary in a lot of ways. And,
Right.
you know, just air conditioning and being indoors all the time really, really makes you soft.
And that's why sometimes I refer to you as one of the last true cowboys, because you are kind of a legitimate, still rancher, farmer type cowboy.
Well, my father more so than me. In fact, when my father passed away 8 years ago, we basically liquidated the herd, so to speak. We sold the cows. I think of myself more as an equestrian than even a cowboy. There are actual real cowboys are all around us, and I've sent you videos of them. They're out in the Winnie and Hampshire Finette areas. They're cowboying every single day. We have a relative that cowboyed out in New Mexico, and you want to talk about some real hands, and you want to talk about harsh conditions, and people that are really doing some real cowboying. It's going on. But I've tried to preserve the lifestyle. I support people that work to preserve the Western way of life. And by Western, I mean the American West and Southwest. I think that the American cowboy is an amalgamation of mainly Anglo and Hispanic cultures that met in Texas and developed in Texas primarily post-Civil War in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. And, you know, there's an ethos, there's a myth that has developed around the American cowboy. They were not all saints. They were not all John Wayne or the cavalry riding in to save the day. I mean, there were some real hooligans and bad people. But the image of the cowboy and the Western way of life is something that by adopting, by supporting, it's helped combat that emasculation that we've talked about. It's helped, you know, in the agrarian, quasi-agrarian, and blue-collar life that I was raised in up in Jasper, up in the woods, you know, holding on to something like that and practicing the arts of horsemanship and maybe roping and just taking care of animals in general helps preserve manhood and in a very positive way.
Sure.
And so I don't really consider myself a cowboy. When people call me a cowboy, I take it as a compliment, and I'm definitely an equestrian. I drive a team of horses, and I definitely support the Western lifestyle.
Yeah, very fascinating. Well, we're going to switch gears from the quintessential Texan to the quintessential American that we've all known to love as Theodore Roosevelt. And it may surprise you, I'm actually not much of a reader. I consume a lot of intellectual content through audio and video. I was a big fan of podcasts, and so I started a podcast to showcase some of the interesting people in Southeast Texas. And I started getting into some of the documentaries and watched one on Teddy Roosevelt, and I was fascinated right away to kind of piggyback on what we were talking about of when he was a young boy. He was rather sickly, and his father said, well, you need to go lift weights, and you need to learn how to box and eat meat and work out and just be a man. And it kind of molded him to who he is now. And I had no idea. You brought a fabulous collection of works of Theodore Roosevelt and memorabilia, and I never would have guessed that there would be a comic book or a recent comic book created about Theodore Roosevelt. But then I got to thinking, if there was ever a president that were embodied of a superhero in a comic book, it would probably be TR.
Right. It's amazing. And Joshua and I talk about this a lot. My sons, if you read, if people want to really know about Roosevelt, I commend them to Edmund Morris's trilogy, which is a biography, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography that he wrote about every aspect of Roosevelt's life. And he is the closest thing to a superhero that you will ever see on this earth. I mean, he's up there with the greats immemorial. And in my book, he is the quintessential American. You've already hit on the beginning of his life. It started out. Now, he was born into wealth.
Right.
He was born into a family of wealthy merchants in New York. And
what kind of year was that?
Just before the Civil War.
Okay.
And his father actually did not participate in the Civil War. I think he actually hired someone to take his place in the battle.
Okay. Yeah.
Which there's a lot of debate about the effect that had on Theodore. His father was a well-respected man, very well-respected. And in Theodore's mind, he was the greatest man that ever lived. Mm-hmm. If you read any of Theodore's writings about his father, he loved him dearly. And you're right. His father set him on a path of physicality to overcome Theodore's own physical weaknesses. Not only was he an asthmatic as a child, but he had very, very poor eyesight. And if I remember correctly, they didn't figure out that he needed glasses until he was about 14 years old.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Now, by this time, he was a very precocious, very active young boy. He hunted small animals, and when he killed them, and he killed a lot of animals in his lifetime, I mean, he was bloodthirsty. He's a bloodthirsty guy.
Yeah, it was funny that, he actually went on, as an adult, he went on excursions and pretty much stocked the Smithsonian.
Right, with specimens from Africa and South America.
Right.
But that began as a child. He would he reeked of formaldehyde because he was always, dissecting birds, squirrels, small animals, and bringing them into the house and then preserving them, and basically setting up his own, natural sciences laboratory. He was very precocious, well-traveled as a young child. His family's travels included Egypt, Europe, and so he was taught at home. He was homeschooled, basically, what we would term homeschool.
And that type of travel back then was very uncommon because you had to get on a ship.
Exactly. Yeah, he was the first president to fly in an airplane.
Yeah, that's right.
And so he was born prior to the Civil War. He was old enough to witness Lincoln's funeral. In fact, there's a famous photograph of him and his cousin standing, I believe, in either his uncle's or grandfather's flat in New York, watching the Lincoln funeral procession go by. He loved Abraham Lincoln, and was a big pro-union guy and loved Abraham Lincoln. And I think that had a big effect on his politics and his interest in politics, his fascination with Lincoln. And perhaps his father's non-participation in the Civil War may have also driven him in terms of his own military interest later on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're talking about a life that began in the 1860s and then moved through the 1880s, 1890s, and then he ascended to the presidency with the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. That has always, that time period has also fascinated me because I don't know if you know this, but Spindletop, the famous Texas oil gusher,
that was going on then.
came in 1901, the same year that he became president. I mean, the United States was in a period of rapid transformation during his growing up and then into his presidency. And it's really, really when we became an industrial behemoth.
Yeah.
So that's the time period we're talking about.
Right. So we were switching from, horse and buggies into big factories and steel and railroad and airplanes, trains, and automobiles.
Right. Now, Theodore grew up in New York. He was a New York guy and was born into wealth and privilege. He wasn't coddled, as you can imagine. He rode horses. He rode horseback. He jumped. He didn't just ride. He rode well. He boxed, as you pointed out. He stopped boxing later in life when he lost. He was in a fight with someone in the White House, actually was in a sparring match, and he lost the sight in one of his eyes as a result of that.
And I guess that was the reason for the famous monocle that we know about.
Yeah, very, very possibly. And if you look in the pictures, you can see like one of his eyes doesn't open quite as far as the other one.
Yeah.
And so he's obviously suffered an optic injury.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's just the kind of guy he was. He was rough and tumble. He had Japanese judo masters come into the White House, and he trained not only in boxing but judo.
Oh wow.
But before all that, of course, he spent time in the Badlands and the Dakotas. He formed the Rough Riders. And fought in the Spanish-American War.
And so the Rough Riders is very unique because it was basically, tell us what was going on then to cause him to basically round up a bunch of buddies and horses and go down to Cuba?
Yeah, and fight the Spanish-American War, which he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Clinton posthumously for his actions in the Spanish-American War. So let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
Roosevelt had gone out to the Badlands of the Dakotas. The Dakotas weren't even states, right? He had been out there previously. At that time, as I understand from what I've read, you got on a train in New York and you headed west, and the train line ended in the Dakotas, and so that's where you got off. And he had been out there and done some ranching and cowboying, but when he really, really went back to the Dakotas was after the darkest time in his life. He went to Harvard in undergrad, and I think I pointed out to you when we first got here today, he actually wrote a very famous work called The Naval War of 1812 as an undergrad in Harvard.
Yeah, so there's, it's a very famous book, The Naval War of 1812, Part 1 and Part 2, and, just imagine... for all the listeners, what you were doing in college.
Right. Well, what TR was doing was not only making excellent grades and courting his future wife, but he wrote a book that you just showed the camera that became a textbook at Annapolis. That's how well written and exceptional a work of history and tactics that it is. Now, he's an undergrad at Harvard when he wrote this. Yeah. It's just phenomenal. So he had done that and had married his sweetheart, but at a point in time, his mother and his wife died within 24 hours of each other.
Oh, wow.
They had a brand new baby. He and his wife had a brand new baby, and his mom died, his wife died, and basically he kind of lost it. He left his daughter in the care of his sister, and got on a train and went to the Dakotas and to try to recover emotionally and mentally. And those were his cowboying days. And he ended up buying into and forming 2 ranches. He met a lot of the people that ended up being Rough Riders with him later during the Spanish-American War. And he proved himself in the American West of that time, and that's super important for him politically later on. Now, imagine this. When he shows up in the Dakotas, he's wearing full leather buckskin outfit. He has a rifle inlaid with glass from Tiffany's of New York, okay? He has a pistol of the same make, and he's wearing glasses. He's a Four Eyes.
Yeah.
In the eyes of the cowboys. And it's like, who is this dude?
Yeah.
Who is this dandy?
Like a city slicker.
Here's a city slicker. And that's how he was perceived.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew that. He was smart enough to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
But he earned his chops with the cowboys. At one point, and if you read Morris's account, it's just fascinating. He forms a posse, becomes, and tracks down some thieves.
Yeah.
He rode well. He worked hard. He fought. He got in a bar fight and proved himself, basically, as a man. And he had prepared himself physically, not just intellectually, but physically for the challenges of the West. And he proved himself. And if you look at his life, everywhere he went and everything he did, he proved himself over and over. The Rough Riders is in fact, the other thing about, in addition to the book, the Naval War of 1812, he's written about 40 different volumes. He was a man of letters. He wrote well, and his books sold well. His hunting books that he wrote about his time in the West sold well. But his bestseller of all time would be The Rough Riders.
Yeah.
And so that actually made him wealthy. He lost money in the cattle business, and his family, they said, look, we got money, but we don't have Rockefeller money. I mean, we don't have the kind of money that you've gone out there and lost. So he wrote, and his books sold well. And, I think he initially sold 400,000 copies of the Rough Riders, or maybe he made $400,000, which is the equivalent of millions of dollars. He made millions of dollars off the equivalent of millions of dollars off his writings. And so he was self-made again after he lost his wealth in the cattle business. And the cattle business was a debacle because his herd got wiped out by an incredible blizzard. That's all part of the stories if you read about him. It's all in Morris's account.
Yeah.
But to make a long story short, he had risen to the rank of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and was basically running the naval portion of the War Department. Mm-hmm. If you read about what was going on in that time period, he pretty much was one of the instigators of the Spanish-American War.
Oh, okay.
And once war broke out, he resigned his post and went and applied for and received a military cavalry commission, came to San Antonio, and this is his Texas connection. And if anybody's ever been to the Riverwalk and the Menger Hotel, his station, his base station for recruiting the Rough Riders is the Menger Hotel in San Antonio and the bar there. And that's why it's so cool to go and hang out there when you know the history.
Yeah, and what happened, if you equate that to nowadays, that's almost like the Secretary of the Navy saying, I want to get away from this desk job and go fight in the trenches.
Right.
That would never happen now.
Yeah, I want to go to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It's
unheard of.
I'm going to go to Syria. Mm-hmm. Okay? But that's what he did. It's incredible. And so if you look at, he had made all these relationships back east at Harvard, and a lot of the guys that he hung out with were very physical. The athletic club he was in, they were polo players. They rode well because this was a cavalry unit and an infantry unit. And the other guys that he was friends with were from the Dakotas, and so they're cowboys. And so this group of people from the West and the East were recruited by him to form this military unit, and they got their commissions and went and fought in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And it's incredible. And so
I guess they had to load up all their horses on ships.
They loaded on a train in San Antonio, and they went by train to Florida.
Wow.
And then they got on a ship in Florida and then unloaded in Cuba, where they, prosecuted the war. He took 2 horses with him. The first night there, the first day there, when they finally got to unload, the longshoreman accidentally drowned one of his horses.
Oh.
And he was irate. And apparently profane, which he was not. The thing about Roosevelt, he's super moralistic.
Right.
Incredibly moralistic. And according to some of the historians that I've read, basically a fundamentalist Christian and taught a Sunday school class his whole adult life. And it just doesn't get reported very much, but it's pretty clear from his writings where he stood on family and marriage. And
and so he wouldn't drink in excess.
And he wasn't profane.
He wanted to be professional.
But when the longshoreman dropped his horse in the ocean and it drowned, he lost it. But anyway, that didn't start well, but he led the charge in, and of course the famous charge up San Juan Hill, put himself at the front of his unit, did not shirk any responsibility. Also didn't miss an opportunity to have his picture taken or to write about what was happening.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment on that. I think that if you could bring Teddy Roosevelt into 2019, he would trend very well on social media, and I'll explain. When he was in the Wild West, busting criminals, photography was very new then, and it would take a long time. You would have to have this big equipment. They didn't have portable technology back then. So I heard about this one story where he busted up a gang of criminals and hog time, whatever, brought them back into town. He made the criminals reenact the takedown so that the camera could get a shot of it, and then grouped them together and then stood behind them and got another picture.
Right, exactly. And he figured out really quick that the press could be his friend. Now, you mentioned social media. The social media of the day was the newspaper.
Yeah.
And the major newspapers and the magazines of that day, that is what people relied on for their news and their social interaction. And the newspapers in New York, for example, printed two editions a day.
Right.
And special editions on top of that.
Yeah, that's like looking at Facebook in the morning and looking at Facebook in the evening, and he used it as a tool to his advantage.
He knew right away the importance of having the press on his side.
And he was kind of a loud guy too, right? When he spoke at crowds.
He was very flamboyant. He was an excellent orator. He had a high nasally voice. He's one of the first, or if not the first, I think he actually is the first president that's on that we have moving pictures of.
Right.
And I'm sure he would have been all over television, and then cable TV.
Yeah.
Because he understood the power of the press, and he was always a reformer. And if you think about Tammany Hall, the political machines of the day, they were corrupt, and he was not. Right. And so he railed against corruption. He was a police commissioner in the city of New York. He is credited with modern policing, and by that I mean standards of policing, fitness tests for police,
right?
Standardized weaponry, standardized uses of force, and just training in general. He brought about the modern professional police force and ended corruption where he could. Now, his attempts to eliminate all vice in New York City ultimately were not successful, but everybody saw the effort, including the press. And so he was always seen as a counterculture, counter-political, rage against the machine politician, and was always, very moral, very much a family man, and he wasn't phony. He wasn't a fake. And the press picked up on that and championed him.
Right, yeah. Well, whenever I was thinking about having you on, I said, one thing that I really want to do is have you read the famous Man in the Arena speech in Mitch Templeton's voice.
Well, thanks. I'll do that, and it's an honor to do it. I have this hanging in my office. It's the first thing that I hung up on the door of my office, and I know that there are a lot of attorneys that relate to it, a lot of trial attorneys. This is actually taken from a longer speech that he wrote, but it's the most famous portion of it, and you'll often see it on plaques.
Yeah, this is the one that you usually see as a poster or...
Right. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Yeah, that's very motivational and powerful.
It is, and it's all about, that's who he's, Roosevelt was not the best equestrian. Roosevelt was not, he wasn't the smartest guy at Harvard, okay? But you weren't going to outwork him, and he did what he said he was going to do. Mm-hmm. He's just a great role model for Americans then and now.
Yeah, and in life, a lot of people are scared to try things because of failure, and failure is where you learn.
Yeah, how to succeed. Mm-hmm. And what worries me, and I've embraced technology. I mean, I'm here talking to somebody on a podcast.
Sure.
And my generation, I've always used computers. We used computers in undergrad, and I always used them in my law practice. Mm-hmm. What concerns me is video games, for example, or virtual reality. Mm-hmm. And what I've often said to young people is, and I know everybody doesn't have the same opportunities I've had, but it's like, why play a video game when you can do the real thing?
Yeah, sure. Like a sport or...
these young people do shoot-'em-up games. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't you play airsoft or
paintball? Right, yeah.
Because then you have the actual tactic, and you also have the sting of the projectile actually striking your body.
Yeah.
And so I think, with my own sons, I worked real hard to expose them to realities of life. When we went deer hunting, when they shot a deer, I would have them walk up to the carcass and say, do you see the devastation that this weapon caused this creature? Do you see the entry wound? You see the exit wound? This is what it looks like when a human is shot. Mm-hmm. Imagine that's your brother laying there, or imagine that's a hunting buddy laying there. That's why you always are going to be careful with your weapon, because this is the result of the weapon being used on a mammal. Mm-hmm. But the whole experience, the whole hunting experience, which TR was a huge hunter, like we've already referenced, mm-hmm. but, spending time together in the field, appreciating nature, the thrill of the hunt itself, the success of shooting the prey, it's just, it's reality.
Yeah.
Why do that? Why not do that instead of do it in a digital world?
Yeah, and it's truly life-changing when you have to go and hunt an animal and then eat the meat that you harvested from that animal. That
right.
really opens your perspective on things, and you want to do that all the time instead of going to the supermarket. It makes you want to.
It does. The physicality of it, though, makes you respect what we have now. Mm-hmm. In other words, our life is so easy compared to even when Roosevelt, was growing up. And it's gotten easier and easier with each generation. Right. Each generation has its challenges. But being in the field, in the cold and the heat, field dressing an animal, butchering an animal, just the blood, the gore, mm-hmm. the physical strain that it requires to get that done makes you appreciate the protein that we have readily available to us at HEB.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
And
mm-hmm.
but unless a young person gets out and engages in that, they don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And I think also, the violence that's depicted and participated in video games creates a false sense of what that's really like. Mm-hmm. And again, when you see the blood and the gore of an actual hunt, you realize this isn't a game. Mm-hmm. This is devastating. And I think you have a better appreciation of what the act of using a weapon actually means.
Yeah, that's a good point. And being out in nature caused Teddy Roosevelt to want to start the national parks. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, my three favorite presidents are all Republican: Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Reagan. Mm-hmm. And, modern conservatives criticize Roosevelt for the executive actions that he took. Mm-hmm. And he set the tone really for a really active president in terms of exercising executive authority, and he just set aside huge swaths of land in the American West and really all over the United States that we now enjoy as national parks.
And we're a little unique as Texas. We have a lot of private land versus public land. We're kind of the opposite of that. But a lot of those public land end up getting leased out, for hunting, and we have good state parks, just not a whole lot of national land.
Right, and I don't know how I have friends and acquaintances that hunt in the national forest up in Angelina County. And it's pretty incredible the deer that they're taking out of them now because they've been managed properly. But the whole concept of wildlife management and preservation of natural resources was made popular by Roosevelt. And I think that, he will be criticized by individuals who see America as, too influential around the world, building an empire, if you will.
Right.
I mean, he believed in projecting American force where it was appropriate. And, of course, he's penned the famous walk softly and carry a big stick. I mean, he was a huge believer in peace through strength.
Yeah.
But when things got hot, he believed in American power, American firepower being effectuated, to bring about what he perceived to be the moral and correct result. So he will be criticized by a lot of people for that, but I think a lot of those same people would appreciate him for his preservation of nature and natural resources.
And his determination probably had something to do with the Panama Canal, because I believe the French wanted to initially start the Panama Canal and try to do a small version of it, and it didn't work out.
Right. Well, if you got to remember too, at the turn of that century, between 1800 and 1900, malaria and mosquito-borne diseases were a huge impediment.
Yeah, there was lots of things that people were dying of then that are just either eradicated nowadays, or I always say, people get the flu, off and on, or it's flu season. Well, people used to die of the flu. It's amazing.
Well, yeah, in 1914, there was a huge flu epidemic after World War I that killed millions and millions of people. But yeah, the Panama Canal was physically doable with the engineering that humans had at that time, but it was incredibly difficult.
And most people know, but to preface that, until the Panama Canal was completed, all ships that wanted to go to and from had to go completely around South America just to get from one side of the world to the other.
Right. So they had to go around the Horn of South America, the very bottom tip, to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean.
Almost Antarctica.
Right.
Yeah.
You had to go almost
to the bottom of the world to get to the other side.
Right. That's right. And you couldn't go the north.
Yeah, you're landlocked
because it's frozen and landlocked. But anyway, he solved that problem, and he did it by whatever means necessary.
Yeah, he said, we're going to go down there and we're going to cut a hole between Mexico and South America, and we're going to drive ships through it.
Right. And he gained control of Panama politically. And then he built it. But he also, what he brought to bear was American ingenuity, not just American military and American political prowess, but the idea of hygiene, the idea of mosquito control. They didn't have DDT and other, but they used smoke, hygiene, mosquito nets. He brought all that to bear on that project, and of course, the Panama Canal was successfully completed. And he had everything to do with that. It's just phenomenal, the mark that he left on our country and the world.
And so his first presidential term was by way of, he was the vice president, and so he moved into, there wasn't an election, basically. But then after that, he, I guess, had to be reelected again.
And he was.
Yeah.
And there was no prohibition on presidential terms at that time,
right,
but he had promised the voters he would not seek a third term.
Okay.
He was wildly popular.
So did he kind of do 2.5 or
1.5?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so everybody wanted him to. They said, "Look, we know you promised that, but no, go ahead and do a third." Well, he was so
That's amazing, because how often do you see that now? If they could let Trump run indefinitely, he would probably do it.
Well, and FDR did it 4 times. Was
Yeah.
elected 4 times, and so his cousin was president for 4 terms. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break his promise,
Yeah.
and so he didn't run. But yeah, so here's what happened. He was Republican. First of all, the only thing I've ever read that he ever quit was law school, which as an attorney has always kind of struck me. I don't know if he did a semester or a full year at Columbia Law School after his undergrad at Harvard, but he was there just a short period and said, you know what, this isn't for me. But he immediately became interested in politics and in the New York political scene, and New York politics was run by Tammany Hall, and it was corrupt as can be.
Yeah.
And he was a reformer and a Republican. It was dominated by Democrats. He's a Republican. He comes in. He's a reformer. But he also wanted to reform things that Republicans were taking advantage of.
Yeah, he would get crossways with some of the Republicans as well.
Big time. Okay? He was his own man, and he was a reformer. And
He was very hard to define at that time.
And neither party liked that. They liked the status quo. And
fall in line.
Yeah.
And do what we tell you.
what we might call the swamp nowadays, right?
Yeah,
and he always ran on, I'm going to drain the swamp.
Yeah.
And so he was not liked in either party. And so the Republicans, I think, thought to themselves, well, we're going to stick him into the vice presidential role.
Because they usually don't do much.
And they usually don't ever go anywhere, at that
Wow.
time especially,
Yeah.
And so he actually wrote to people. If you read his writings, he's like, I don't know if I should do this because they're going to tuck me away, and this is probably going to be the end of my political career. Well, lo and behold, President McKinley was assassinated,
Yeah.
and Roosevelt became president. And if you read some of the writings, they're like,
Boy, were they in for a surprise.
the Republicans even like, oh, this madman is now
Yeah.
president.
I think about that sometimes now with all the impeachment hearings that the Democrats, and I think, man, I never would have guessed they were such a fan of Mike Pence. I think they forget that, yeah, you get Trump out, but then,
You get Pence.
yeah, which is the most conservative. I mean, you better tell the Democrats to get ready for Bible classes, basically, at that point. We're talking about the guy who, he got national attention because he needed to go to a political lunch or a business lunch or something of that nature with a female. And he said, well, I'm going to bring my wife with me. And they didn't know why. And he said, well, I don't go to places alone with another female without my wife present for, integrity purposes.
Right.
And so,
That's who you'll get with Pence.
yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what happened. I mean, they everybody loved McKinley or wanted McKinley, and they got Roosevelt because an anarchist assassinated McKinley.
Okay.
And he shot, and they thought he was going to survive, but he developed gangrene of some kind. They didn't have
that's right.
modern antibiotics, and he passed away. And then Roosevelt ascended to the presidency.
Well, let me show off some of these collections that you have here. So this one is Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to His Children, and that's a thick book too. That's
Right. Now, and what I encourage people to do, there's multiple ways to learn about Roosevelt, and you can either he like I said, he published 40 volumes himself, including the Naval Battle, the War of 1812. He wrote about his hunting adventures. His most popular book was called The Rough Riders.
yes.
But in terms of third persons, I think the best way to get to know him, I would commend and encourage people to get this trilogy by Edmund Morris. Pulitzer Prize winning, just a fantastic, lively account of Roosevelt's life. If you read these books, you will be a Roosevelt fan. Promise you for the rest of your life. These other sources, like the letters to his children, which of course he never intended to be published, give you real first-party insight into the man.
Yeah, because like you said, he's writing those directly to a person. He didn't know that people were going to find them later and turn them into a book.
Right, and he never intended those to be published. But what they bear out is that he is who he said he was. He is the person he claimed to be. The other source that I would encourage people to look at is there are other people that were his contemporaries that wrote books at or near the time of his death, and this is a famous one. It's called Roosevelt, A Story of a Friendship, and it's by a real famous author named Owen Wilster, who published a novel called The Virginian that is the prototype for the modern Western story.
And that's neat about those books that you acquired some of them from eBay and Amazon secondhand, and so they still have markings in them from whatever library they came from or members of a book club. You know, this one says
Joseph Pinnock, 1930.
Yeah, from 1930.
And he obviously purchased this book as part of a book club, because if you open to the back, there's a hand-typed book club list, and it's got the members of the book club and the books that they were assigned to read that year.
Yeah, on an old typewriter from the early 1900s.
Yeah, and so this would have been typed up in 1930. And these names would have been written down in pencil and ink here in 1930. And you can Google these names, and sometimes I find these people, and I can certainly find every one of the books that they listed and read in their book club.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, the book itself is fantastic in terms of the relationship between, and this is a Harvard buddy of his who became a famous jurist and then a famous novelist. But, you know,
that's a lot of stuff that you can't experience in an audio book.
Right. It's tactile, and it's got these other sub-histories that are inside the...
It has that library smell to it.
Yeah.
You know, it brings you memories back. Well, what are some of the differences between Theodore Roosevelt and his cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt? And why do you think, you know, FDR, looking back, saw all these people admire his cousin predecessor, but he went his own way?
Yeah, he did, and was a great president in his own right. But I don't know. Roosevelt was considered progressive and is considered progressive. So some people might say that there's not a big difference between Theodore and FDR. Unfortunately, of course, FDR was greatly hampered physically,
right,
because of his illness, and was not nearly as physical. And
was FDR more of an intellect versus...
No,
not at all.
Just the opposite.
Oh, okay.
No, because I mean, Theodore, in my opinion, was much more of an intellect. He's a man of letters. I mean, he is a multi-volume published author, a best-selling author.
It's almost like he was the smart kid in school and the jock at the same time, and he almost knew that. He knew that he had to be at his peak mentally and both physically as well.
Right. He's self-deprecating in a lot of ways. He's like, I'm not the smartest guy, but no one's going to outwork me kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Well, he was plenty smart, okay? He read voraciously. I mean, he read constantly. And he didn't just read ancient history. He read modern works. So I don't think Franklin was that kind of individual. I think Teddy is the intellectual of the two, and of course, because of the illness that FDR suffered from, Teddy was much more physical.
Was FDR more introverted?
I don't think so.
No, maybe in comparison, I guess.
Well, I think FDR. Well, you know, FDR had an affair that's well known. That would have mortified Teddy. I mean, Teddy was a moralist.
Yeah.
FDR carried on, and at least one I know of extramarital affair that's widely known and reported and talked about. I think they had a very different moral compass, and I don't know why that developed differently. I mean, they're cousins.
Yeah.
But they're raised by different people, so.
Right. Did they spend much time together?
Not that I know of.
Not at all. Yeah.
Not that I know of. They knew each other, and the Roosevelts are a tight clan. They still are today.
Yeah.
I mean, and the thing is about Teddy, there's so many clubs and associations that his life has spawned.
Have you ever done any ancestry on yourself to see where it goes?
I have, and we do have some remote link to him, but it's very remote.
Yeah.
I actually, that's a whole different show, but I had a great, if you say it 14 times, grandfather who came over on the Mayflower. So
yeah.
He was also the first European that was unfortunately terminated with capital punishment.
Oh, well, the first ever.
In the New World.
In America.
For allegedly murdering a man. My family's always...
What was the punishment back then? Do you think it was hanging?
Yeah. Oh, he was hung. Yeah. We all think he was framed.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's it reminds me of National Treasure, where Nicolas Cage finds out that he's related to the, I guess,
A
John
cad.
Rose Booth. Yeah, that's right. You think, well, I wanted to be related to Reagan,
Well, you can't pick your ancestors,
or
right?
Lincoln. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You can't pick your ancestors. I mean, that's just the way it is. But yeah, his name was actually John Billington, and his history is well documented also.
Yeah. Let me show the people these comic books here.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you said, they're kind of a it's like a Wild West steampunk theme, where you have the Victorian era steam engines, futurism, and they got the Industrial Revolution. They've got, oh yeah, it's totally steampunk. Check out the guns that they're using here, and the series is, I guess it's named Rough Riders by Aftershock Comics.
Right.
June 6, 1898, and it's got everybody in, three-piece suit and bow ties. Yeah.
Yeah, and it
really
takes
neat.
famous people from the time period
So
and
here,
turns them into superheroes.
Harry Houdini. You got Harry Houdini chained up underwater. He's part of the Rough Riders, and Teddy's overlooking him.
Right. You got Annie Oakley.
Yeah. Man, that is something else. Now, where did you find these online?
Yeah, I saw them discussed in an article, and then they're available on Amazon.
So I think this is Thomas Edison.
Right.
With the electricity, which I would have an offense to that. I would want Nikola Tesla rather than Edison.
Absolutely. Tesla would have been a lot better for a character, I think.
Well, you like you said, you do a lot of cowboying, and you're a truck guy. I saw you pull in. You've got the long wheelbase, which is rare. The extra gas tank. Did you see the unveiling that Elon Musk did of the Tesla truck?
I saw the headline. Apparently, the headline said it was a debacle of some kind.
Well, I'll tell you what happened, because I'm a huge Tesla fan. So it comes out, it looks like a spaceship. I'll show you a picture here so we can get your reaction. But it's kind of like a big reveal. There's lots of fanboys there, and they're going through the specs, of 500-mile range for a battery, 14,000 pounds of towing capacity. You can almost get a gooseneck with that. It races a Porsche 911 and beats it. They put it end to end to an F-150. It drags the F-150. So all these impressive specs. They take a sledgehammer to the stainless steel body, doesn't dent. They did some. Shot it with a 9mm shatters against the body. Just wipe off a smudge and you're good to go. They dropped a ball bearing on the glass and it didn't break. So then, just kind of jokingly, he said, we'll throw it at the window. He threw it at the window and it spiderwebbed. I don't know how, but you can guarantee the way that Elon Musk is, because they have about a year before you can actually acquire the truck. I think the thing is going to be blast proof by the time, because when he has a whole group of people that really love his technology and love him, and then he has a whole group of haters, and I think he's gonna go back to the drawing board and just make the whole thing. But here it is, and you'll probably think it's not going to be very functional as a.
Let me tell you what people don't know. The power that can be generated with an electric motor far exceeds the internal combustion engine drivetrain.
Yeah.
Locomotives are diesel engines powering electric motors.
Right.
People don't understand that.
For torque purposes.
Yeah. And they generate tremendous torque. Obviously, a train, and so I can see, and most guys that have any mechanical ingenuity at all can understand the potential.
Right.
Where they get offended, and I think I include myself in this group, is that his efforts are being underwritten, and guys like me who drive a traditional internal combustion or diesel-powered truck suffer at the regulatory aspect of what's going on. I drive an F-350, and I remember very well an F-350 being the most simple, basic, diesel engine, easy to work on, easy to find fuel for. The skin of the truck being truly heavy duty. You could throw ball bearings at it or do whatever, shoot it with a 9mm and do very little damage to it. Well, now, because of the CAFE standards, the diesel is choked to death.
Right.
The skin, most of it is not even metal.
Yeah. Real thin aluminum.
I set a railroad tie on my tailgate one time, and I bent the tailgate.
Yeah.
And so for guys like me, it's not that I hate him or I'm mad. that what he is doing is kind of being crammed down my throat.
Right.
Is what I feel like.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And so it's funny because I have people tell me, well, you don't need that truck. I've had lawyers that literally have jets, their own jet, tell me, well, you don't need that heavy-duty truck. And I'm like, are you listening to yourself?
Yeah.
You have a private jet.
Right.
It's outrageous. I mean, and so, you know.
Yeah, here's so the bed of the truck, you know, retracts. You fold down the tailgate. The tailgate has a ramp, and then they drove a little battery-powered ATV up there. I kind of just like the innovation.
It's great,
and I like where they're headed.
I do too. I have no problem with it.
The design's a little weird. You know, it looks like what we used to draw when we were kids, and we draw like the future. I think, and that now they made it.
That's okay. I mean, I would never have imagined trucks looking like what they look like now, but they're great. I mean, you know, if you take my F-350, and it's very capable when it's not breaking down because of the emission control failures. If you take the emission controls off of it, it's phenomenal. The torque it generates, the power that it has.
And for older trucks that are in about the 80s and kind of the mid-90s, the ability to work on it yourself was huge for me back then. You know, my very first truck was a 1996 Chevy Silverado, and almost everything that needed to be done I could do myself. But now, you know, there's so many electronics and things that you don't have access to, and specialized tools and fuel filters that are on top of a gas tank that require you to drop the tank in order to access instead of just a simple inline filter.
Right. If you think it was good for your age group, you should have been in mine. I mean,
oh yeah, everybody did everything themselves then.
We worked on trucks from the 60s and 70s, you know, in the 80s.
Yeah.
And early 80s. And I mean, you could do anything. We pulled engines, pulled transmissions, undercarriage work.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Sometimes you needed a special tool, but that was just to get leverage, or, you know, it wasn't because, you know, you had to have an electronic component.
Yeah,
replaced.
you just didn't own a cherry picker, probably.
Yeah, you didn't have what you needed to get the proper leverage, or, you know, to hold something while you moved something else. But I mean, you could do it all. And there were shop classes that taught you how to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
And not just trucks. I mean, I took welding. I didn't know growing up the way I did, it's just such a blessing because I welded, I did carpentry work, I poured concrete, and a kid could have those kind of jobs. I mean, as a teenager, as a 15 and 16-year-old, I worked on huge industrial concrete jobs. And I learned things from that, not just the construction aspect of it, but interacting with adult males on a job site, meeting their expectations for getting a job done, withstanding their practical jokes and harassment.
That's back when men were men and boys were men.
Well,
right?
Theoretically. Of course, back then they were probably whining about some of the things that we're complaining about. But yeah, I mean, that concerns me. And I think Roosevelt, if you look at Roosevelt, coming back to kind of the genesis of the conversation, he was a man for all seasons. He was the whole package, physically, spiritually, mentally, you know, academically. And then he got the job done in the real world. I mean, he did it all, and he prepared himself throughout his whole life and never stopped learning, never stopped striving, never stopped winning and losing. You know, he suffered great losses. His mom and his wife dying on the same day. His son was killed in aerial combat in World War I. He went on a disastrous trip down a tributary of the Amazon after his presidency and almost died. In fact, instructed the people that were with him, leave me here, I'm going to die. They carried him out. But he did a significant amount of physical damage to himself late in life and died in his sleep in his 60s. And I think I think he shortened his life. Is
there much known about maybe the last 10 years of his life?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, he published.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. During the last 10 years of his life, he would have formed a third party, which is the Bull Moose Party.
Oh, yeah, that's
which
right.
split the Republican Party and led to the Democrat winning that year. He, like we just talked about, went on a trip down a tributary to the Amazon, the River of Doubt, wrote a famous book about that trip, barely survived it. So, yeah, we know everything about the last 10 years of his life. Lost his son. He was a big advocate. I've got another book I didn't bring with me, but it's a series of essays that he wrote cajoling the isolationists who did not want to get involved in the war in Europe in World War I. He was a big proponent of intervening in that war. He was a huge proponent of gaining control of our southern border, which ironically we're still talking about today. But I mean, the Pancho Villas of the world, were raping and pillaging on the southern border at that time, and he was no longer in power, and he was basically cajoling the U.S. military and the U.S. leadership to get control of that border. Writing essays and people published what he wrote because people cared what he thought and what he wrote.
It's almost like he's modern, what we would call in the modern day, like the bloggers, because he would go on a trip and then he would write about it.
Exactly.
And report about what he did. And we see that now, when we go on vacation and we're on Instagram and we talk about what we're doing, and you kind of create your own media. Almost like I've done here. I didn't have somebody from a news station or the FCC say, hey, you got a show, get the guests. I just did this from scratch, and I hit publish, and it's out there. It's global. Somebody can listen to it if they want to or not, and you kind of garner an audience based on how interesting your content is. And he, has a very big audience.
It's a perfect analogy. I mean, that's what he did. I mean, his actions and his accomplishments led to his popularity. And so he remained relevant throughout his entire life. If he traveled somewhere and wrote about it, people wanted to read it.
Yeah.
And so he had an audience that he developed through his actions, through his understanding of the media of the time, and ultimately his accomplishments. He was beloved. People loved him. And some people hated him.
Yeah. Well, Judge, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Let's wrap this up. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the listeners?
Sure. What I'd like to tell them is that I think Teddy Roosevelt is very relevant to today. He is the quintessential American from my viewpoint, and I mean that because of his efforts morally, physically, politically, in every way. He was America first, America all the time. He spoke against hyphenated Americanism, that he called it. He believed in unity. He believed in public service. And his life story, even though it occurred during a time period very different from ours, is still very relevant and still very fun to read about and learn about today. So I would just encourage everyone to do it. I know personally, in my life, I try to pattern parts of my life after TR. He's a role model for me. And so in terms of my physicality, in terms of my life experiences, I want to do things the way he did them. And so I think he's a good example for people. And if you've got children, I think he's a good person to introduce them to.
Yeah, for sure. I've got two. My daughter's 13. My son's 11. My daughter, her personality is just like me. She's a social butterfly. And then my son's very introverted. So, whenever the pastor tells you to stand up at church and shake hands with the people around you, that's like his nightmare. And, so I'm working on him, because I'm in the business community, networking with people, shaking hands, and I have to try to teach him that side of things so that he can grow up and look people in the eye and stand up and shake their hand. And
that's important.
I don't know if you've ever seen the show. Maybe your son has Parks and Recreation.
Yeah, I've seen it.
The Ron Swanson character. He's kind of he was more libertarian, but he's kind of the same in a fun way. He does carpentry and he has a Ron Swanson pyramid of success to be a man.
Right.
And it kind of it speaks to that positivity of masculinity in a good way.
Well, I think
that's what we need.
I think masculinity is not toxic per se, and when things get bad, no one's worried about toxic masculinity. I mean, you've heard that talked about. Are there bad men? Of course there are. They're all there's bad people of every stripe, but men, fathers, brothers, sons are critical to an ordered society. We need strong men. We need physical men. We need men who protect us. We need men who guide us. We need men who offer counsel. We need men who participate in civic events. We need men who sit in judgment of disputes. Men are relevant. Men are not toxic, and manly men are not toxic.
Yeah, and I think those manly men, they love their women and they respect them, whether it be their wife or their daughter,
And they take care of animals and children and do it in a loving, wholesome way.
sure.
There are a lot of men doing that, and so I don't think masculinity is automatically toxic.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. I enjoyed it. Learned a lot today about Teddy Roosevelt and so many different ways. There's books, there's movies, there's documentaries, and there's even comic books. Thanks so much for coming on, and appreciate you reading The Man in the Arena. That's I definitely want to trim that down and put it on a preview. So, all right. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks.
Wait, go. Go, right.